Well, that's very kind of you, Barbara, and many, many thanks for inviting me. In 1948, Arthur Ransome went to Durham University to receive an honorary degree. He was in very good company. Barnes Wallis was honoured in the same ceremony, although not for the bouncing bomb, which was still a secret. The composer Edmund Rubra was on the list, along with the poet Edith Sitwell. Distinguished company. That day did not end well. Once the ceremony was over, Ransome stormed out, refusing to even go to the dinner for the honorary graduates, and thereafter he systematically removed it, all biographical references, to what I've called the Debacle in Durham. You'll be very hard-pressed now to believe the event took place at all. His entry in the Dictionary of National Biography doesn't mention it. There's nothing in Who's Who. There's nothing in Who Was Who. The search becomes a little bit like one of those photographs that Stalin edited. You begin to wonder whether it really happened at all. But it did happen. So the question is, what on earth went wrong? And more to the point, why? And it's a long and rather tangled story. It begins in April 1917. Aboard the famous sealed train that the German authorities allowed to carry the architects of the Russian Revolution from Zurich to Petrograd. This is a declaration that the passengers accepted the risk of being imprisoned when they got there. Among the crowd waiting their arrival in Petrograd was the 33-year-old Arthur Ransome. I'll come back to his reasons for being there. First of all, I want to consider who was on the train and who wasn't. This undoubtedly copyrighted painting, The Journey, the Sealed Train, is a painting of Lenin earnestly speaking to a group of soldiers. The truth of the matter is actually rather different. The revolutionaries making their way to the Zurich train station actually looked like a bunch of businessmen, sober citizens, one and all, not a banner among them. And very few people realized that they were, in a sense, emissaries of the German High Command. In 1917, as you know, Germany was fighting the Great War on two fronts. And for the Chief of General Staff, Max Hoffmann, these Russian revolutionaries exiled in Switzerland were a godsend. He deployed them, I use his words, to and hasten the undermining and poisoning of the morale of the Russian army. Lenin is to be conveyed through Germany to Petrograd in the same way that I send shells into enemy trenches. I have the right to employ the expedient of propaganda against his garrisons. So, in fact, Lenin's popular uprising was financed by Germany with the aim of extracting Russia from World War I, although Lenin kept it to himself. It was orchestrated as a part of a propaganda campaign of unparalleled sophistication. And I'm going to briefly consider two men, one you'll know, the other I think you may not know, because both have links with Arthur Ransome, although neither was on the train when he saw it arrive in Petrograd. The first because the Germans wouldn't let him go, the second because the Russians wouldn't let him get off the train, sent him on to Switzerland, to Stockholm. This is the first man, Willy Munzenberg, the man who never made the journey, that because the Germans were too fearful of him, the Red Millionaire. In 1917, Munzenberg's career was only beginning, but without him, the Russian Revolution may well have found it. Munzenberg was liberally financed with German money by Lenin to organize and establish front organization in support of Bolshevik revolution. Over the next few years, he set out to recruit artists, authors, journalists in particular, actors, musicians, even dancers to the Bolshevik cause. He termed them members of his clubs of innocence. And the complete list of the individuals that fell under his spell is staggering. Heinrich Mann, Aldous Huxley, Francois Mauriac, John Reed, H.G. Wells, even Clement Attlee. The contemporary world, the world we live in of Twitter and Facebook, owes a great deal to techniques perfected by this man. I put a translation on the right side of this slide. Above all, Munzenberg needed journalists, and he assiduously sought them out. In 1917, Arthur Ransome of the London Daily News had already, in effect, defined himself as a prime target. An apparently ingenuous author, a member of Petrograd's cultural elite, someone on first-name terms with the great and the good of British political life, someone with an extraordinary web of connection to British and Russian press and to the literary establishments of Paris and London. I'll turn now to the second man who you will know. Lenin's travelling companion, a Ukrainian political agitator who'd adopted Polish nationality and renamed himself Karl Radek. I'm going to be rather cruel about Radek, so you may want to come back to me about it. He shared a compartment with Lenin in the sealed train, a compartment that was piled high with newspapers in dozens of languages. Arthur Ransome's work for the Daily News, prominent. Radek was a highly intelligent man. He spoke half a dozen languages, all of them very badly, according to Ransome. He became Bolshevik's Minister of Propaganda, editor of The Torch, its periodical. He was described by one historian as the jeering cynic of the revolution's rationale. And like Munzenberg, he had a pathological interest in lying. Everything really important, Radek claimed, was based on falsehood. As a result, falsehood became for him a kind of truth. We shall come back to this paradox. We shall meet it several times. This was the man charged with implementing the political seduction of Arthur Ransome. Radek was not allowed to get off the train in Petrograd, but he returned after the October Revolution and became Vice Commissar for Foreign Affairs, responsible for Bolshevik propaganda. He was among those that negotiated the treaty to withdraw Russia as a combatant in the Great War. In other words, he realized Germany's principal strategic ambition, albeit at horrendous cost to the Russian populace. Now, if we're to believe Arthur Ransome's autobiography, Radek became a close friend, a confidant, someone he appeared to admire. Indeed, the versions we see of him through biographies of Arthur Ransome generally present him as an almost comic character, scurrying between Europe's capitals, waving his revolver, orchestrating revolution with an impish grin. And I confess I find this increasingly difficult to swallow. It's a little like reading that Adolf Hitler was a good-natured chap when you got to know him, nice with dogs and children. Whereas the ugly truth is that Karl Radek was a close associate of a fanatical fellow Pole, Felix Jasinski, director of the Cheka, the unbelievably brutal state security service. Radek was in effect one of the architects of the Red Terror, set in train the very year he met Ransome. So we must surely ask the question, albeit briefly, if he was Ransome's friend, what sort of friendship could that be? You surely don't befriend one of the more sinister characters of a sinister century. To be specific, how could you possibly befriend an enthusiastic supporter of Lenin's famous hanging order? I can only find part of this. This is an autograph. This is the hanging order. It's a 2-page telegram that I've got a translation. We need to set an example. Hang without fail, and do it so that the public see. At least 100 notorious kulaks, the rich. Publish their names. Take away all their grain. Use your toughest men. That's Lenin's order. You can't befriend someone who defined his purpose in life as the extermination of the enemies of the revolution, pitting class against class, extracting the last ruble, the last pearl necklace from a tormented bourgeoisie. Not to mince my words, I'm not mincing them, Karl Radek was a monster. How could anyone, least of all the author of Swallows and Amazons, look kindly on a man who watched numberless thousands deprived of the means to live? Someone who would look on, unmoved, as babies were sold for meat on the streets of Petrograd. So, we must conclude that Arthur Ransome was incorrigibly, unbelievably naive, perhaps. And some, including the critic Ferdinand Mount, have come to that conclusion, but I think that they are plainly wrong. Arthur Ransome was too intelligent, too perceptive, too well read, and too emotionally engaged. So I'm going to offer you a more subtle solution to this problem. Lola Kinnell was a friend of Arthur Ransome, perhaps more than a friend, who knew Ransome very well. A well-connected young woman, she thought him clever, if a trifle childish. I quote, with a queer mixture of contempt, dislike and love for England. But you note this politically astute woman did not find him naive. So what's the alternative? I'm touching, of course, on the very vexed issue of where Arthur Ransome's true allegiances lay, a topic on which it's impossible to be definitive. In his biography, Roland Chambers flirts with the notion that Ransome was willfully blind to wickedness, almost callous, and I think that is also plainly wrong. Indeed, certain events in his life, and I include what happened in Durham, strongly argue for an alternative, more complicated, and for Ransome's perspective, more painful conclusion. My claim is that the Arthur Ransome mingling with the crowd as Lenin stepped down from the train was very far from being the puppet of Munzenberg and Radek. Albeit at that stage, no more than a useful amateur, he was already acting as an agent for the British security services. Yes, he was eventually outmaneuvered by professional spies, but this is not particularly to their credit. If Arthur Ransome was naive, it was in one crucial respect only. He appreciated far too late that those tempted to practice espionage often condemn themselves to a life of duplicity and lies. Which is incidentally why I was intrigued by Oscar Oza's life and wrote his biography. Back to Arthur. When Arthur had arrived in Petrograd at the outbreak of World War I in 1914 and was finding his feet, in faraway London, the British government was busy establishing the War Propaganda Bureau. At a meeting in a remote country house, all the significant artists and authors of the age were brought together. And if this sounds familiar, it is. They were sworn to secrecy, recruited to promote the British cause in the Great War. Arthur Conan Doyle, Arnold Bennett, John Masefield, Ford Madox Ford, G.K. Chesterton, John Galsworthy, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells, all of them to write patriotic prose to order. Some, you may have noticed, were already Munzenberg's innocents. There's a price to pay for this. In Ernest Hemingway's opinion, written many years later, I quote, "There was no really good, true war book during the first 4 years of the First World War. Writers either wrote propaganda, shut up, or fought." The artist Paul Nash, certainly no pacifist, wrote, I quote, "I'm no longer an artist. I'm a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever." I'll leave you to look at that while I bring this section to an end. Ransome's letters at the time suggest that he was not conflicted in this way that Nash might have been. What he was aware of was the price that war was exacting on the weakest and poorest members of Russian society. He proposed setting up an organization in Petrograd entitled the International News Agency, with the aim of presenting a realistic evaluation of the situation in Russia to a worldwide audience of readers. His hopes of actually running it were dashed when the job was given to the novelist Hugh Walpole. But for several years he worked under the aegis of this bureau, producing books, articles, essays, jointly with Karl Radek. From Ransome's perspective, what they were doing, what they were writing together, was no more than the truth. In no way did it betray the British cause. This was not, of course, Radek's motivation. His aim was to present the most favourable view possible of Bolshevism. Excuse me. And if that involved lying with Ransome's truth, so be it. So this uneasy collaboration went on and became rather more than purely literary. In 1918, finding himself unable to leave the country and in great danger, Ransome was forced to turn to Radek for help. The price of his escape, one might say of his life, was to smuggle 3 million rubles out of Russia for the use of the Bolshevik International. Apparently, he was given no option. He ensured that MI6 knew about the arrangement, but he was inevitably and permanently compromised. Oddly enough, then, if Ransome the spy deceived anybody, it was Radek. Ransome's spymaster in Petrograd was the Scottish-born diplomat Bruce Lockhart. It's a rather flattering picture of him on the cover of a book. He's a romantic character, very romantic character, well worth a talk in its own right. Lockhart was a close friend to both Arthur and Evgenia. So if you harbour doubts about where Arthur Ransome's true allegiances lie, bear in mind that Bruce Lockhart, together with the ace of spies, Sidney Riley, was implicated in a plot to assassinate Lenin. There's no doubt about it. Lockhart was a professional spy, an implacable enemy of the Bolsheviks, committed to their overthrow. If he had believed for a moment that Arthur Ransome, the amateur, was any kind of double agent, he would have instantly unmasked him. Bear in mind also that Bruce Lockhart had known Trotsky's secretary, Evgenia Shelopina, long before Ransome ever met her. Lockhart had described her to his masters in London, I quote, "a very useful lady who's been of the greatest service to me and is anxious to establish herself in Stockholm, where she would be at the centre of information regarding the underground agitation in Russia." More than enough hint, surely, of her relationship with British intelligence. Perhaps we're dealing not with one amateur spy, but with two. In 1919, Ransome secured permission to join a party of American journalists, then in Moscow, to go on a visit to London. The party included William Bullitt, who was to become US ambassador to the new Soviet Union. Ransome was almost certainly aware that Bullitt was carrying secret letters from Lenin. It was obviously an espionage operation. He himself was carrying the notes for the book 6 Days in Russia. He left Evgenia behind to stay with her family in Moscow. I think he was unaware that publishing this book would place her in very, very, very great difficulty. He took with him the notes for 6 weeks in Russia. It's a book that made his sympathies for the Russian population plain. They were then literally starving in great numbers. He did not, however, endorse Bolshevism. And I can't really agree with Hugh Brogan's assessment that it is a book of frankly Bolshevik propaganda. You note he declares himself not a communist. But this was a distinction lost on Whitehall's mandarins in Petrograd, and news soon chased Ransome and arrived in London. News from Colonel Alfred Knox. Knox was the British military attaché in Petrograd. He wrote in some agitation about this rogue journalist that he discovered who'd got himself entangled with a foreign woman who was fraternizing with the enemy, with little better than a Bolshevik himself. And in time-honoured fashion, his recommendation was that Ransome should be shot like a dog. He had no idea, of course, that he was talking about someone who'd been an agent of the British government for many dangerous years. But as John le Carré has taught subsequent generations, it's the fate of spies, amateur or not, to be hung out to dry. The famous quotation that an ambassador is an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country applies equally well to spies. Once you start lying in a good cause, you cease to be honest in any cause. So far from being welcomed by the London intelligence establishment, as he confidently expected, perhaps even offered a job in the Foreign Office, Arthur Ransome was ignominiously arrested at King's Cross Station and bundled off to Scotland Yard. The account of this meeting with Sir Basil Thompson, head of the Special Branch, is told as a bit of a joke in his autobiography. Thompson had Ransome's intelligence file in front of him. He was well aware that his position in Petrograd had been personally endorsed by 2 foreign secretaries, Balfour and Curzon. He also knew, of course, that Ransome had been forced to smuggle funds on behalf of the Bolsheviks. He was well aware that this interview was something of a charade. The same cannot be said from the series of very menacing interviews that occurred in the following days, not greatly discussed in the autobiography. This ambitious young Australian diplomat making his way in the Foreign Office was also well aware of Ransome's true allegiances. Sir Reginald Leaper. He wrote, Mr. Ransome is not an agent of the Bolsheviks. Then he added the gratuitous insult, he has not enough sense to see through them. He fiercely opposed Ransome ever returning to Russia, throwing in an anti-Semitic jibe to clinch the argument. I quote, his interest is simply for the safety of himself and of the Jewess of which he's enamoured. I've no faith in him whatsoever and could not recommend anybody with so dishonest a mind being sent to that hotbed of all lies. For his part, Ransome had made plain his objections to being interviewed by a callow young man he referred to as a temporary clerk. He did not realise how dangerous an enemy he was making over the course of these deeply unpleasant interviews. Their paths would cross again. So I've brought you to 1919, the birth of the Roaring Twenties, the overture to what Auden call a low, dishonest decade. Years that ended in yet another war. Years in which Arthur Ransome and Rex Leeper trod very, very different paths. Evgenia did eventually manage to join Ransome in Sweden, having purchased her own escape from Moscow by agreeing to smuggle pearls for the Bolsheviks. In 1924, the two were married. In 1929, back in his beloved Lake District, Arthur Ransome persuaded a decidedly unenthusiastic Rupert Hart Davis, a junior partner at Cape, to publish a book called Swallows and Amazons. And the rest, you might say, is history. Hart Davis became a friend of Ransome, but that didn't stop the firm slowly defining him as a difficult author. To read Ransome's diaries is to discover the private face of someone who became ever more protective of reputation, ever more touchy, even willing now and then to rewrite history a little. The public face was an entirely different matter. A ransom for Christmas became every child's wish, and I include this child. The printing press could barely keep up with reprints. Ransome was phenomenally successful. Only, I think, J.K. Rowling in the present era could come at all close. Even the Queen bought a copy of Swallows and paid cash for it. But no public honours came his way. His old boss in Petrograd, Hugh Walpole, was made CBE almost immediately, 1918, for his secret work. In 1937, he was knighted. Ransome, arguably more influential secret work, was not even acknowledged. He did not even receive the time-honoured Consolation Prize, an OBE. Nothing. This at a time when English authors were routinely honoured. Graham Greene, J.B. Priestley, Aldous Huxley, they let it be known that they wouldn't accept mere knighthoods. They would hang on for something better, like an Order of Merit, a tactic that worked for the first two. In 1932, extraordinarily enough, John Galsworthy received the Nobel Prize in Literature. English letters were riding high. So if you find this lack of public recognition for England's most celebrated and influential children's writer strange, imagine how Arthur Ransome felt. He was an extraordinarily perceptive man, perhaps all touchy people are. He was also steeped in the devious ways of espionage. He surely realised he'd become the object of a blacklist. And the reasons for his exclusion from the upper echelon of English cultural life are not too hard to find. In one of the most poorly guarded secrets of World War II, the intelligence agencies purged the civil service of communists and Bolsheviks. Their aim was to ensure that, quote, undesirable persons played little part in public life. Indeed, it was not until 1937, the year in which Pigeon Post secured the first Carnegie Medal, that Ransome's MI5 file, buried in the bowels of 124 Cromwell Road, was finally declassified. Even then, someone scribbled across the cover of the file, "A most mischievous person." Even the note confirming the closure of the file can be seen as a kind of betrayal. I quote, "He did some good work for us. There's always been a suspicion he was leaning towards Bolshevism." The man charged with bringing about this systematic purge of Bolshevism or Bolshevik tendencies in English cultural life was Ransome's old nemesis, Rex Leeper. As the country drew closer to war, Leeper headed Britain's political warfare executive, who was placed in charge of national propaganda. In a sense, opposite number to Karl Radek, becoming one of the most influential figures in English political and cultural life. Leeper's views on the nature of effective propaganda were only distinguished from those found in the Soviet Union by the fact that these were our lies rather than theirs. Radek himself would have happily endorsed the proposition that a willingness to lie is essential to capture the public mood. In a secret internal memorandum to civil servants about the working of the Emergency Powers Act, written by Leeper, you find the following: "The people must feel that they're being told the truth. Distrust breeds fear much more than knowledge of reverses. The people should be told that this is a civilians' war, a people's war, and therefore they are to be taken into the government's confidence." But what is the truth? We adopt a pragmatic definition. It's what is believed to be the truth. The government would be wise, therefore, to tell the truth, and if a sufficient emergency arises, to tell one big thumping lie that will then be believed. This is the Rex Leeper who, in this somewhat tainted context, founded and then took charge of the British Council, defining its role in terms not unlike those prepared for the Petrograd News Agency. Indeed, he pointed to similarities between black propaganda and the task a novelist faced constructing believable fiction. He set out, like Willy Mutzenberg, to recruit a secret army of celebrated authors capable of prosecuting Britain's propaganda war and purchasing assent in a clandestine way. His list was very long, but there was no place on it for Arthur Ransome. Defined by others as something of an outsider, Arthur Ransome came to define himself as a man doomed to take second place. Sorry, I'm having a sip of water. His response to an ill-concealed closing of ranks against him had consequences for his fiction, in particular the use of what amounted to private jokes, or japes as he called them, as autobiographical allusion. I have time for only one. Read my book, as they say, if you want to see the others. Is this the reason for the remarkable number of allusions to pearls in Ransome's fiction? Interestingly, if they are allusions, they are, with one exception, references to failure or to promise unfulfilled. We know that Evgenia bought her life with smuggled pearls. What, one might ask, did she make of the treasure in Peter Duck, which turned out to be just a few pearls and not gold after all? And the pearls in Titty's pearl diving game in Swallows and Amazon. You recall that these too lost their allure once they dried out on the bank. The allusion was obviously significant to Ransome because he comes back to it in Swallowdale. I mentioned there was an exception. Crucially, it occurs in a novel that symbolically places Evgenia centre stage, Missy Lee. In Missy Lee, the allusion to pearls is more direct and more audacious. The children are led by Roger flaunting his pearl to tempt the dragon, but ultimately it's Missy Lee herself who rescues all of them. The hair-raising description of the descent of the gorge is one of the most exciting passages in the whole canon, but also the most ambiguous. The characters are brought to safety, complete with Captain Flint's smuggled goods, by the action of a strong, capable, determined, yet supremely conflicted woman, a woman who found her loyalties painfully divided. Ransome had good reason to think himself unjustly characterised as an outsider, but he did not restrict his revenge to gentle literary allusion. There was also a political response, one with personal consequences. I refer to his decision to make common cause with someone else hung out to dry, the most celebrated and reviled literary outcast of the age. In 1940, P.G. Wodehouse had been living for years as a tax exile in Le Touquet. He was arrested by German troops. Arrested at the same time was a far more obscure British citizen named Noel Mackintosh, who was then working as a war cemetery gardener. And both men were taken to an internment camp, a former lunatic asylum near Tost in Silesia in Poland. So the only picture I can find of Wodehouse in Tost. There's no time to talk about the year that he spent there, except to mention that he managed to complete a novel and write 3 new ones. When he was released, a year later, on account of his age, he reached the age of 60, the mysterious Mr. Mackintosh, although much younger, went with him, and both were put up in the Hotel Adlon in Berlin. It was there that Mr. Mackintosh persuaded Wodehouse to make a series of comic broadcasts over German radio to his readers in the USA. My War with Germany, a light-hearted look at life in the prison camp, faithful to the resolution of the inmates not to whine. It was a joke that fell flat, wrong-footing London in a propaganda war. A hysterical campaign of denunciation was set in train, and in no time at all, Wodehouse's books were removed from libraries. They were questioned in Parliament, calls for him to be tried for treason, even executed, along with John Amory and Lord Haw-Haw. At the war's end, Wodehouse was moved to an internment camp in France, outside Paris. It was actually a former maternity hospital. Life was very far from being safe. You remember this was the time of the épuration that followed the fall of the Vichy regime. The traumatised Wodehouse was interviewed for 4 days by Major Edward Cusson of MI6. I find this photograph quite moving. The emaciated Wodehouse with his thin hands clutching his little dog. The Cusson report completely exonerated Wodehouse. He'd been, quote, unwise to make the broadcast, but a failed effort at whimsy hardly justifies prosecution, let alone execution. Shamefully, the Cusson report was never published. It was immediately classified with the name of Wodehouse's mysterious companion, Noel Mackintosh, blacked out. We know now that he had been an MI6 double agent. Somebody, we'll never know who, decided that protecting that name justified leaving the threat of prosecution for treasonable conduct hanging over Woodhouse for the rest of his life. He never returned to England. It's easy to understand Ransome's interest in someone like Woodhouse. The two men had carved out very similar paths to literary success. Both had foregone university. Both had become inured to the rather patronising critiques of their more sophisticated peers. Both had unwittingly been drawn into intelligence intrigue. Both were fated to discover that fame and popularity does not secure you a place at the top table. And both, of course, were casually betrayed and hung out to dry by an uncaring intelligence service. In 1941, with the hysteria at its height, Arthur Ransome chose to make common cause, writing to his friends that Evgenia was reading The Luck of the Bodkins and the house was rocking with her chuckles. Now, you did not, in August 1941, go out of your way to praise P.G. Woodhouse. He was writing Missy Lee at the time. We've already seen how he sneaked in a joke about smuggling pearls. His reference to The Luck of the Bodkins is part of the same joke. It's a book about efforts to smuggle a pearl necklace through customs. Its star is Lottie Blossom, an American film star who keeps an alligator in a wicker basket to deter the customs men. There were other writers willing to risk their reputation defending the reviled Woodhouse, most notably George Orwell. But it was a risk Arthur Ransome could not afford to run. He could not afford to make these very public literary allusions. He burned the last of his boats, and there were bound to be consequences, and these can be found in Durham. On the 10th of February 1948, well into his 60s, still without garlands round his neck, Arthur Ransome received a handwritten letter out of the blue from Sir James Duff, the Vice-Chancellor of Durham University, giving him advance notice that the registrar would soon be inviting him to accept an honorary degree. In fact, the formal letter arrived the very next day, and Ransome replied immediately that day, accepting the offer enthusiastically. You should perhaps have read it more carefully. Both letters refer to the award of an MA degree, not the customary honorary doctorate. But Arthur Ransome was not a university man, and the distinction seems to have passed him by. I think Sir James Duff realised this because he sent another letter, this one filled with rather clumsy hints. Don't bring evening clothes, he wrote, nor any kind of formal dress is needed for the ceremony. Now, Arthur Ransome probably remembered the newspaper pictures of Mr. Woodhouse in his Oxford finery that were widely circulated when the campaign of denunciation was at its height. So it was a warning signal, but he missed it. For reasons we don't need to go into, the role of Vice-Chancellor at Durham at that time alternated between two people. So while Vice-Chancellor Duff nominated his childhood hero for an honorary degree, it fell to Vice-Chancellor Lord Percy to settle the details. And who was Lord Percy? Former diplomat, Conservative politician, educational reformer, rector of King's College, which became Newcastle University. Crucially, I'm conscious of the time. I haven't excluded my time. Okay, nearly there. He was rector of King's College, eventually became Newcastle University. At that time, he was chairman of the British Council. You remember the British Council, that creation of Ransome's nemesis, Rex Sleeper. Lord Percy and Rex Leeper were close friends. Both men in those far-off revolutionary times had supported the doomed intervention force against Soviet Russia. Both passionately hated Bolshevism. Both despised Arthur Ransome for what they saw of years of journalistic double-dealing. Decidedly, Lord Percy did not view Arthur Ransome as a suitable candidate. Much of the correspondence surrounding this affair has disappeared, and believe you me, I've looked for it. But the agenda of the Honorary Degree Committee in Durham University at that date does exist, and I'm grateful to the archivist for making it available. It suggests lively meetings. This is a page of the agenda. You may not be able to read it very well. It says long before the days of the photocopier, decisions were made in a committee and inked in at the meeting by the registrar, or possibly, I suspect, by Lord Percy himself. At the bottom here on the left, you can see his proposal to give Miss Vita Sackwell West an honorary degree received a perfunctory no. But there was no such reservation for Miss Edith Sitwell, who got through on her name alone. This is Arthur's page in the same minute. I think the entry gets off to a bad start. What's written here about the children's books is lazy, and it's also not really true. And there's no reference to his literary work on Wilde or Poe, or to his contribution to literary theory, or to his books on Russia, and indeed nothing about his contribution to Britain's war aims. And there was evident unease at the meeting at the idea of bracketing someone with Ransome's literary reputation alongside, if you look above, poor Alderman Adams, however worthy the Cumberland Development Council might be. It seemed at one point the discussion led to somebody desperately inking in M. Lit in a half-hearted compromise, but too late. The die was cast. Poor Arthur Ransome, in a crumpled lounge suit, would have to shuffle past with Alderman Adams and all the other also Rands, and then sit through the laureation addresses for his betters. I've called this a debacle, which is perhaps a little dramatic. After all, who now remembers Lord Percy? But it's worth considering the motivation for this rather spiteful act, and I will finish by doing just that. Return for a minute to the frankly hysterical response to P.G. Wodehouse, and you discover something surprising. There were in fact literary reasons that his work was so greatly infuriated the great and the good of his age. I don't believe for a moment that Churchill thought that his broadcasts posed a threat to national security. No, what annoyed him was a succession of novels that seemed out of tune with the political zeitgeist. Wodehouse was a far more subversive author than any number who wrote earnest works, politically committed. George Orwell, for instance, was at least aware of this. Wodehouse created a version of reality which had no time for politics, no time for posturing. Repeatedly, we're brought to face the holiness of the heart's affections, a very uncomfortable truth in times of war. In the polarised 1940s, more than enough, in the eyes of some, to declare him a subversive heretic. Can we find a parallel in the literary works of Arthur Ransome? I think the answer is yes. In his best work, particularly in the Enchanted Lakes novels, you find something equally subversive. He gently reminds the readers of an England that's rooted in a far distant past, a mythical place, which while it never existed, we're more than content to inhabit. What is it, asks Margaret Drabble, apart from buttered eggs, marmalade, small boats and fair play, that gives Ransome's fiction its enduring power? Her answer comes close to the truth. The world we enter each time we open one of these well-read books is not the real world. It's a land of myth, not of reality. Far from creating an Edwardian minotaur in which children mimic the imperial concerns of their elders, Ransome described children without spite, devoid of malice, never cruel, mischievous perhaps, but never mean and never wicked. Little wonder the critics tempered their praise with unease. He seemed to have created a world without sin. Some years ago I was trying to sum up Ransome's idyllic world, and I fell back on a half-remembered quote.